It all started when my friend Jason came across an ad online. Spend the night in the Real Conjuring House, if you dare. The Rhode Island farmhouse, notorious for its supposed hauntings, had been turned into a sort of haunted bed and breakfast by its new owners. Jason, ever the thrill-seeker, couldn't resist. He booked us a night without even asking. I wasn't thrilled. I've never been a fan of horror, and the idea of staying in a place with such a dark history made my skin crawl. But Jason was excited, and I didn't want to be the killjoy, so I agreed to go along, thinking it'd be a creepy but harmless adventure. We arrived at the house on a crisp October evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the decrepit property. The house was exactly as you'd expect, old, with paint peeling off the wooden siding, windows that were clouded with dust, and an aura of abandonment that clung to every creaky board. The owners, an older couple named Ed and Marge, greeted us at the door. They seemed normal enough, friendly, with a touch of the rustic charm you'd expect from lifelong New Englanders, but there was something off about the way they looked at us, like they were sizing us up. "You're in for quite the night," Marge said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But remember, whatever happens, don't leave your room after midnight." Jason chuckled, thinking it was just a scare tactic to heighten the experience. But Ed's expression was serious, his eyes dark. "Trust us," he said quietly. "Stay in your room." Our room was on the second floor, at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The air inside was musty, with a faint, unpleasant odor lingering beneath the scent of old wood and dust. The room itself was small, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that overlooked the shadowy woods behind the house. Jason was giddy, setting up his camera and ghost hunting equipment. He kept trying to provoke a response from the supposed spirits by calling out into the empty room, but all we heard were the normal creaks and groans of an old house. As midnight approached, the atmosphere in the house seemed to change. The air grew colder and the silence became oppressive. Jason, still intent on catching something paranormal, was glued to his camera, scanning the room for any sign of activity. I was just counting down the hours until morning. Then, just after midnight, we heard it. A loud, thumping noise from somewhere in the house. It sounded like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. Jason grabbed his camera and we cautiously opened the door, stepping into the dark hallway. The noise was coming from below us, near the living room. We crept down the stairs, the old wood groaning under our weight. The house was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the moon through the windows. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, we saw them, Ed and Marge. They were standing in the living room, their backs to us, facing something we couldn't see. The thumping noise continued, rhythmic and unsettling, echoing through the house. "Ed!" Jason called out, his voice shaking. They didn't respond. Instead, they slowly turned to face us, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Their expressions were vacant, almost robotic, and their eyes were unnervingly wide, as if they were in some sort of trance. "What the hell is going on?" I whispered, gripping Jason's arm. Before he could answer, Marge began to speak, her voice low and monotone. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "You need to leave." Suddenly the lights in the house flickered on and off, casting the room in a strobe-like effect. The thumping grew louder, more intense, and the air seemed to vibrate with an almost electric energy. Jason and I backed up, terrified, as Ed and Marge advanced toward us, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Go!" I shouted, pulling Jason back up the stairs. We sprinted to our room, slamming the door behind us and barricading it with the dresser. Jason was panicking, fumbling with his phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Then, just as quickly as it started, the lights stopped flickering and the house fell silent. We sat there, breathing heavily, our hearts pounding in our chests. But then we heard it. The faint sound of voices, whispering, right outside our door. Jason put his ear to the door, trying to make out what they were saying, but all he could hear were disjointed words, fragments of sentences that didn't make sense. And then, suddenly, a voice rang out clear as day, cutting through the whispers like a knife. "Help us!" Jason jumped back, staring at me with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, fear tightening its grip around my throat. The voice had been a woman's, and it sounded desperate, pleading. But there was something else in it too, something familiar. "Help us, please!" It was Marge's voice. "What the hell is happening?" Jason muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. We both stared at the door, listening as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Then, without warning, the door began to rattle, as if someone on the other side was trying to force it open. We backed away, terrified, as the door shook violently. The whispers turned into screams and suddenly the door burst open, revealing nothing. The hallway outside was empty. We didn't wait to find out what was going on. We bolted out of the room, running down the hallway and stumbling down the stairs. But as we reached the front door, we stopped dead in our tracks. Ed and Marge were standing in the doorway, blocking our exit. But something was wrong. Their faces were contorted, twisted in unnatural ways, and their eyes, those vacant, dead eyes, were fixed on us. "You shouldn't have come here," Ed said, his voice distorted like it was coming from far away. "We're trapped." Before we could react, they began to convulse, their bodies jerking violently as if they were being electrocuted. And then, as suddenly as it started, they collapsed to the ground, lifeless. But the horror didn't end there. Behind them, in the shadows of the room, figures began to emerge. Dozens of them, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes wide with terror. They moved toward us, their movements slow and deliberate, like they were being controlled by some unseen force. We were surrounded, trapped with no way out. The figures closed in on us, their eyes pleading as if begging for release from whatever hell they were trapped in. And then, just as they were about to reach us, I felt a sharp pain in my head, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the living room, the morning light streaming through the windows. Jason was beside me, unconscious but alive. Ed and Marge were gone, and so were the figures that had surrounded us. We stumbled out of the house, not daring to look back. We drove away as fast as we could, the events of the night replaying in our minds. But as we reached the outskirts of town, Jason suddenly pulled over, his face pale. "What is it?" I asked, my heart still racing. He turned to me, his eyes wide with fear. "I checked the camera," he said, his voice shaking. "There's footage of us, but it's not us." Confused, I grabbed the camera and played back the video. What I saw made my blood run cold. The footage showed Jason and me, but it wasn't us. It was two other people, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, standing in that same hallway, looking terrified. And then, as they ran down the stairs, the camera panned up, revealing a reflection in the mirror of Ed and Marge, watching them, just like they had watched us. The screen went black, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, the camera turned back on, showing one final image, the front of the house with a sign that read, "Vacancy." The footage ended there, but the message was clear. We weren't the first, and we wouldn't be the last. The house was a trap, drawing people in, taking their lives and replacing them with others. It was a cycle, an endless loop of terror, and we had barely escaped. But the worst part? As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for just a second I saw them, Ed and Marge, standing on the side of the road, watching us with those dead, vacant eyes. And I knew, deep down, that the next time someone took that offer, the faces they'd see wouldn't be Ed and Marge. They'd be ours.